The Great Mental Models, Volume 1 by Shane Parrish, is outlining some of the most versatile, all purpose mental models that can help you clearly see the world, improve your decision making, and enhance your productivity. I've pulled out the 6 best ideas from this book, and we're going to go over each one of them one by one so that you can get the best insights in a much shorter amount of time than it would take to read the entire book. I've also created 3 tools from this book that I believe if you implement directly into your life, they're going to have outsized benefits. We'll go over those in the end of the video. You can also see that I've got a map here of this book as well as hundreds of other books and thousands of different ideas from those books. It's completely interactive and it's kind of like an AI web that you can choose your own adventure, whether you want to learn about habits or about goals. This tool is going to be the best way for you to do that. You can learn more down in the first link below in the description. And with that, the first thing we're speaking about here today is just about education and versus the real world. So you can see what we've got right now is just this map of kind of how mental models connecting. So we're thinking about kind of the different mental models, but we're also connecting this deeply to habits. We're talking a lot about learning and creativity. And then we've got goals as our next piece as well. The point of this here is just that education doesn't prepare you for the real world. At least it didn't prepare me. And this is Shane speaking now. I was 2 weeks into my job at an intelligence agency, September 11th, 2001, when the world suddenly changed. My belief that the MBA program was a good use of my time had eroded fairly quickly. When I showed up to write the exam, to find out that it was an open book test, I realized that my expectations were entirely wrong and in need of some updating. Was I in the master's program or was I in grade school? I stopped putting effort into my assignments and started learning about someone who was mentioned casually in the class. That person was Charlie Munger. I went from theoretical examples that were completely divorced from the real world to the wisdom behind the achievements of one of the most successful businessmen of all time. Munger, who you will come to know in these volumes, is the billionaire business partner of Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway. He's easy to like, he's intelligent, he's witty, he's irreverent. Finding Munger opened the door to unexpectedly intellectual pleasure. I felt like I had finally found the knowledge that was useful because it was gained from someone's real effort to better understand how the world works. It was so much more satisfying to learn from someone who had tried to put many of these theories into practice and was willing to share his results. The fact that Munger was so professionally successful made it all the more compelling. Munger has a way of thinking about problems using what he calls a broad latticework of mental models, which, side note, is kind of what we're creating with this map here today as well. These are chunks of knowledge from different disciplines that can be simplified and applied to better understand the world. The way he describes it, they help identify what information is relevant in any given situation and the more reasonable parameters to work in. His track record shows that it doesn't just make sense in theory, but it's devastatingly useful in practice. And my reflection from this quote is just coming from the very beginning of the book. I pulled this quote out because I think it really represents an unspoken truth. It's one that many of us know about, but there's an idea in the modern day that going to school will help prepare you for the real world. And this is something that Shane and I both didn't find to be the case. When I went to school to become a personal trainer, I thought I would need much more knowledge on specific muscle groups, and people would quiz me on the regular to make sure that I knew what they were called, because that's what we were studying, memorization techniques. But when I came out into the real world, I realized that I just needed a better understanding of psychology, habit formation, and business and sales that they didn't really teach me in school. Mental models are things that Shane learned later, and I think you can think of them kind of like this. A mental model is simply a representation of how something works. We cannot keep all of the details of the world in our brains, so we need to use models to simplify the complex into the understandable, organizable chunks. Whether we realize it or not, we then use models in everyday thinking. We decide and understand our world through mental models. While there are millions of mental models, some true and some false, these volumes will focus on the ones that have the greatest utility, the all-star team of mental models. This is 100% how I think about coaching, how I think about personal training, and I've realized that mental models are really running most of our lives that we don't even realize. So that is education in the real world. The next point we're going to make is just that the map is not the territory. So you can see again, the map is not the territory. We're starting off here and we're talking a little bit about goals with map is not the territory. We're talking a lot about mental models, but also I think what we're talking about here really is just this idea that we're getting started and we don't want to think, okay, someone has told me something before, and therefore that's how it's going to be in the future. So we'll get into the quote. Even the best maps are imperfect. That's because they're reductions of what they represent. If a map were to represent the territory in perfect fidelity, it would no longer be a reduction and thus would no longer be useful. A map can also be a snapshot of a point in time, representing something that no longer exists. This is important to keep in mind as we think through problems and make better decisions. Point number one, a map may have a structure similarity or a dissimilarity to the structure of the territory. The London Underground map is a super useful map for travelers, but the train drivers don't use it at all. Maps describe the territory in a useful way, but with a specific purpose. They cannot be everything to everyone. Two similar structures have similar logic. If a correct map shows Dresden as between Paris and Warsaw, a similar relation found in the actual territory. If you have a map showing where Dresden is, you should also be able to get there. Point number three is map is not the actual territory. The London Underground map does not convey what it's like to stand in the Covent Garden station, nor would you use it to navigate around the station. Point number four, an ideal map would contain the map of the map, the map of the map of the map, etc., endlessly. We call this characteristic self-reflexiveness. Imagine using an overly complicated guide to Paris on a trip to France, and then having to purchase another book that was the guide to the guide of Paris, and so on. Ideally, you'd never have any issues, but eventually, the level of detail would be overwhelming. When we mistake the map for reality, we start to think that we have all the answers. We create static rules or policies that deal with the map but forget that we exist in a constantly changing world. When we close off or ignore feedback loops, we don't see the terrain has changed and we dramatically reduce our ability to adapt to a changing environment. Reality is messy and complicated, so our tendency to simplify is definitely understandable. And I think the point here is that this isn't really about maps. It's really about something more prevalent in our lives. Everything around us is kind of a map. This YouTube video is a map. This map, this graph, this AI is a map. This book summary is a map. And also the people selling you get-rich-quick schemes are selling you maps. The problem with these maps is that we think they're fully granular and that they contain all the different iterations of the knowledge you might need. The information is about the entire territory, but of course they don't. They contain a revised view of the author's previous reality. This may help orient us, but it's not a substitute for our own decision-making and thinking process. That's why we get into trouble with the get-rich-quick schemes, I believe, is because really those people are selling you what the territory looked like when they got rich. And of course, the territory has changed and they can't teach you everything that you might need. Similar to this, with this map, you can imagine that if I went to full depth of 5 connections, so this is essentially a depth of anything that's connected to the map is not the territory point at the level of the 5th depth, you can see just how many points there are. And it's absolutely impossible to fully understand each and every single one of these points. But you can see that as I am able to get more and more granular, as Shane was saying with the map, I can get closer and closer, and I can better understand what I'm seeing with this map. So you can see the absolute first depth is we're just connected directly to the Mental Models Volume 1 by Shane Parrish. We're also connected directly to mental models. But when we click on this, you can see, okay, now the Great Mental Models by Shane Parrish has some more ideas connected to it as well. The next one we're going to talk to is the Circle of Competence. And the idea here is that when the ego and not competence drives what we undertake, we have blind spots. If you don't know what you understand, you don't know where you have an edge over others. When you're honest about where your knowledge is lacking, you know where you're vulnerable and you can improve. Understanding your circle of competence improves your decision making and outcomes. There are three key practices needed in order to build and maintain a circle of competence. Those are curiosity, a desire to learn, monitoring, and feedback. First, of course, you have to be willing to learn. And learning comes when experience meets reflection. Remember, we talked about this before. Learning is not purely theoretical. You can learn from your own experiences, or you can learn from the experience of others through books, through articles, and conversation. Learning everything on your own is costly and slow. You're only one person. Learning from the experience of others is much more productive. You always need to approach your circle of curiosity, seeking out information that can help you expand and strengthen it. Second, you need to monitor your track record in areas which you have or want to have a circle of competence. You need to have the courage to monitor honestly so that the feedback can be used to your advantage. A good idea here is to keep a journal of your own performance, and it's the easiest and most private way to give yourself feedback. Journals allow you to step out of your automatic thinking and ask yourself, what went wrong? How could I do better? Monitoring your own performance allows you to see patterns that you simply couldn't see before. And my reflection is that this chapter is really Shane's reflections on things like tourists climbing Mount Everest versus the Sherpas. Of course, the people climbing Mount Everest have a circle of competence, and it might be being an investment banker or something like that if they can afford to climb Mount Everest. But the Sherpas have that circle of competence of climbing Mount Everest. So that's why we need people who are inside of their circle of competence who can perform in that domain, and we want to surround ourselves with those people. While all of that is sounding fun to explore, climbing Mount Everest sounds like a really fun time. I think the big idea here is really just the circle of competence. How to know when you're inside of your zone of genius or when you're outside of your zone of genius. And I've just CC'd my notes on Sir Ken Robinson here. He talks about the zone of genius quite a lot inside of his book, The Element. But what Shane's pointing out here is that the ego sometimes tricks us into thinking that we've got a wider circle of competence than we really do. And a couple of key points are that journaling is something brought up a lot in Stoicism. And I specifically am recommending here How to Think Like a Roman Emperor by Donald Robertson, a really great book I recommend you check out on the channel. Inside of that, Marcus Aurelius has 3 questions that he uses to journal every single day. The first is what went well. And then second is what didn't go so well today. And then third is what can I do better tomorrow? So those are 3 good questions to add into your journaling repertoire. Maybe ask that at the end of your day, at the end of your workday, something like that. Also, a quick PS, Shane is also referencing inside this chapter the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. I really recommend you check out that book, underrated. And it's really about how high-level people, even people at the level of like top surgeons in their domain, can fall prey to not getting feedback on their work and how that's detrimental to not only just them, but to everyone around them. And of course, the patients. Definitely worth checking out. The next piece is first principles thinking. First principles thinking is one of the best ways to reverse engineer complicated situations and unleash creative possibility. Sometimes called reasoning from first principles, it's a tool to help clarify complicated problems by separating the underlying ideas or facts from any assumptions based on them. What remains are the essentials. If you know the first principles of something, you can build the rest of your knowledge around them to produce something new. Socratic questioning, one of our tools we'll be talking about later, can be used to establish first principles through stringent analysis. Socratic questioning can also be used to establish first principles through stringent analysis. Doubled up there. This is the disciplined questioning process used to establish truths, reveal underlying assumptions, and separate knowledge from ignorance. The key distinction between Socratic questioning and ordinary discussions is that the former seeks to draw out first principles in a systematic manner. So we're talking about first principles in a way that we can reproduce. Socratic questioning follows this process. Number one is clarifying your thinking and expanding on the origin of your ideas. Why do I think this? What exactly do I think? Number two is challenging assumptions. How do I know this is true? What if I thought the opposite? Number three is look for evidence. How can I back this up? What are my sources? Number four is to consider alternative perspectives. What might others think? How do I know I'm correct? Number five is examining consequences and implications. What if I'm wrong? What are the consequences if I'm wrong? Number six is questioning the original question. Why did I think that? Was I correct? What conclusions can I draw from the reasoning process? Now, we're going to talk more about Socratic questioning near to the end of the video, but first principles is something that you hear a lot of CEOs and founders talk about if you listen to their interviews with them. For me, this is really just the essence of good decision making, and if you get paid to make decisions, you better have a good process. Think about the last time that you had to make a decision. Maybe it was whether to buy a house, to start a business, or even close down a business. How did you decide? If you're anything like me and the people that I've coached, it's likely that it was a gut feeling, which I don't discount that at all. That's definitely something to take into account. But wouldn't you feel better about your decision next time if you understood why you were making it? So first principles, the Socratic questioning we'll talk about, and also the 5 whys exercise are both great places to start when making those decisions. Our next idea or mental model here is inversion. And inversion is a powerful tool to improve your thinking because what it does is it helps you identify and remove obstacles to success. The root of inversion is to invert, which means to upend or turn upside down. As a thinking tool, it means approaching a situation from the opposite end of the natural starting point. Most of us tend to think one way about a problem, forward. And inversion allows us to flip the problem around and think about it backward. Sometimes it's good to start at the beginning, but it can also be sometimes useful to start at the end. Think of it this way. Avoiding stupidity is easier than seeking brilliance. Combining the ability to think forward and backward allows you to see reality from multiple angles. There are 2 approaches to applying inversion to your life. Number 1 is to start by assuming that what you're trying to improve is either true or false. Then show what else you would have to do to be true. Instead of aiming directly for your goal, think deeply about what you want to avoid and then see what the options are left over. So inside of this chapter, Shane actually speaks a lot about Sherlock Holmes, who is apparently the most successful detective of all time. Obviously not a real detective, but he is the most successful detective of all time, at least in fiction. And he talks about it a lot in how Holmes is kind of the master of making discoveries in investigations that more traditional detectives couldn't. And more often than not, he did this by inverting the question. Given something was true, what also must be true? That's something that Sherlock Holmes would use quite a lot, which gives us the ability just to see our problems from a different angle, and that can often lead us to new directions or discover new solutions. One of the ways that this is showing up in my life currently is via fear setting, which is a tool and using fear setting instead of goal setting. Sometimes with coaching clients, if they don't quite have a clear direction or purpose and they can't really connect to that, I actually invert the question. I say, instead of what's the best possible outcome, I say something like, what's the worst possible outcome? 5 years, nothing good happens to you. What does that look like for you? This allows them to open up from a different perspective, and in my experience, it often leads them to setting meaningful and purposeful goals. So something to check out afterwards. We're going to be doing a fear setting exercise together at the end of the video. Our final idea is about the razors. We've got 2 different razors. The first one is Occam's razor, which you might have heard of before. Simpler explanations are more likely to be true than complicated ones. This is the essence of Occam's razor, a classic principle of logic and problem solving. Instead of wasting your time trying to disprove complex scenarios, you can make decisions more confidently by basing them on the explanation that has fewer moving parts. Hanlon's razor is one that you might not have heard of before. And it's hard to trace its origin, but Hanlon's razor states that we should not attribute malice to which can be easily explained by stupidity. In a complex world, using this model helps us avoid paranoia and ideology by not generally assuming that bad results are the fault of bad actors in our lives. We look for options instead of missing opportunities. This model reminds us that people do make mistakes, and it demands that we ask if there is another reasonable explanation for the event that has occurred. The explanation, most likely to be right, is the one that contains the least amount of intent. So, the main idea of this book is that by understanding these two separate razors here, you're less likely to make bad decisions. So, you're limiting your downside. Both of these razors isn't so much a decision making tool, but a way to check your bias. As humans in organizations or groups, we often want to believe the most complex answer is the correct one. And I believe this is because we want to feel smart for having it figured out. Of course, I definitely fall prey to this as well. But this can really slow us down and cause us to make the incorrect decision. What we want to remember about Occam's razor is that the simplest explanation is often the most correct. We also tend to assume that when someone does something that we view as a slight against us, that they're evil in some way. This happens all the time in the workplace, and it causes us a ton of unneeded stress and anxiety, especially the way that we're working now, where most of us are working remotely. It's easy to get a Slack message or an email and say that someone is just being kind of purposely evil towards us. My company says assume positive intent in every interaction, and I found that to be a very helpful framework. So those are our big ideas from the mental models by Shane Parrish. You can see that we've got education in the real world. We've got the map is not the territory. We've got circle of competence. We've got first principles thinking. We've got inversion in the razors, and those are all in our light blue. And then we've got our tools, which are in our white color here. The first of which is Socratic Questioning, which we went over already. So I'm just going to quickly go over my checklist that I've created for all of you that are already inside of the channel. If you are interested in using these checklists, these tools, this entire kind of personal development AI, again, you can click the first link down below in the description to join the channel. Find out more about that down below. So the whole idea here is that when we need to make a decision, we want to consider these 6 questions. We want to think about why do I think this? What exactly do I think? Clarify our thinking and explain the origin of our ideas. We want to think about challenging our own assumptions. How do I know this is true? What if I thought the opposite? We want to look for evidence. How can I back this up? What are my sources? We want to consider alternative perspectives. What might others think? How do I know I'm correct? Examining consequences and implications. What if I'm wrong? What are the consequences if I am wrong? And then finally, we want to question the original question. Why did I think that? Was I correct? What conclusions can I draw from this reasoning process? And this is great if you're coaching someone. This is great if you're trying to coach yourself. I really recommend you revisit this and actually write down and go through the checklist when you have a moment. The next tool that we're thinking about here is the idea of the 5 whys. And that's something that's been brought up in a lot of different books, but I'll give you a quote quickly. The 5 whys method is rooted in the behavior of children. Children instinctively think in first principles. So this is, again, a tool to get us to think in first principles. Just like us, they want to understand what's happening in the world. And to do so, they intuitively break the fog with a game that some parents have come to dread, but which is exceptionally useful for identifying first principles. Repeatedly asking the word why. The goal of the 5 whys exercise is to land on what or how. It is not about introspection such as, why do I feel like this? Rather, it's about systematically delving further into a statement or a concept so that you can separate reliable knowledge from assumption. If your whys result in a statement of falsifiable fact, you've hit a first principle. If they end up with a because I said so or it just is, you know that you've landed on an assumption that may be based on a popular opinion, potentially a cultural myth or a dogma, and these are not first principles. The first point we're trying to make here is just to ask why. So ask why you want to accomplish this, make this decision, or why someone would do that. And then, of course, the next piece is to ask the same question why 5 times in a row. And this generally helps you get to the root of the issue. This is something that I would use a lot when I was a personal trainer. People would come in and say, I want to lose 20 pounds. And I would often ask the question, why? And they would say, because I want to look better or I want to feel better. And often, if you follow that down the rabbit hole of the 5 whys, you get to the true reason they came into the office that day. And that's why they are actually there. And that's really motivating to people. So that's another great coaching tool that you can use as well. The final tool we'll talk about here is one that I have actually found from Tim Ferriss, and it's called fear setting. And the whole idea is if you're nervous about making a jump or simply putting it off out of fear of the unknown, here's your antidote. Write down your answers and keep in mind that thinking a lot will not improve as fruitful or as prolific as simply brain vomiting on the page. Write and do not edit. Aim for volume here. Spend a few minutes on each answer. Number one is to define your nightmare. And we talked about this already a little bit with one of our previous ideas. The absolute worst thing that could happen if you did what you're considering. Number two is what steps could you take to repair the damage or to get things back on the upswing, even temporarily? Number three is what are the outcomes or benefits, both temporary and permanent, of the more probable of the scenarios? Number four, if you were fired from your job today, what would you do to get things under financial control? What are you putting off out of fear? Usually, what we fear doing most is what we need to do the most. Number six is what's costing you financially, emotionally, and physically to postpone this action? What are you waiting for? If you cannot answer this without resorting to the previously rejected concept of good timing, the answer is simple. You're afraid, just like the rest of the world. My action item is honestly just to write this down on a piece of paper or in a note-taking app, follow the 7 questions above. This works the best when it's done in conjunction with goal setting, but it can also be used when you're just noticing yourself procrastinating on a particular problem. A really great coaching tool. So that was The Great Mental Models Volume 1 by Shane Parrish. Again, if you do want to get access to the full book library of over 100 different books and 1,000 different ideas, as well as a little course on how you can use this personal development AI, click the first link down below in the description and join the channel. For $5 a month, you get access to all of this information. Thanks for being with me, and I hope to see you in the next video.